So the person who inspired the whole Loteria journey is Juan Felipe Herrera. Hopefully you know that Juan Felipe Herrera is the first Latino poet laureate of the United States, and he was born right here in Fowler, California. Woohoo, right? So Juan Felipe Herrera is a native son of the Central Valley who went on to become the most important poet in the United States. And so I went to see him when he was here in February, as maybe some of you were there. He spoke to our campus and was amazing as usual. And so I was inspired, and I said one of the 8 books that I'm going to use in my Hispanic Literature of the United States class is going to be his selected poems, Half of the World in Light. So I innocently start reading my way through this book of selected poems, which of course has excerpts from different books that he's written. And I come across this section called La Loteria, right? Loteria cards is the name of the book. So I'm pretty clueless. I've never even heard of Loteria. I don't know what it is. And the people that put together the selected poems did not provide any information about how this book came to be, which I now realize is a major weakness of the book because it was inspired by artwork that they do not include in the book and all of this. So they really didn't give me any context for what is any of this about. But not my first time ever teaching a class, right? So I'm like, I think I can Google Loteria. I can figure out what the heck it is. I turned to Gina, my beloved colleague, and say, what's Loteria? She's like, oh yeah, like old ladies play this, you know? Like kind of sort of vaguely knew what it was. And so I looked up some stuff. So I will now share with you a little bit of what I learned about Loteria because it turns out that it's like this whole really fascinating thing. So this is what I will show my class. We'll play Loteria just like you, and then you'll learn a little bit about it here. So the game is a colonial phenomenon. It came to Mexico from Spain during the colonial period, and it is distinct from American bingo due to the pictures and the fact that the caller, who is not me, will often recite little poems or stories inspired by the pictures. So there's a whole like oral performance tradition and art that comes out of this. According to artist Teresa Villegas, who does Loteria art, the most recognized version of Loteria is the Don Clemente Gallo rendition, introduced in Mexico in 1887 by the French businessman Don Clemente Jacques. So French guy actually creates this. And the company has continued this version ever since. So this is the one that if you go on Amazon and you pay $5, which is what I did, this is the one you get. It's kind of like the classic one that inspires everybody else. So as you see, as you saw in your game card, simple cartoon-like images, some of which, like the Negrito image, are definitely from the 1870s, like what we would now think of as a racist image. So it's a little dated, but basically simple, childlike, kind of fun stuff. But because there is art involved, people have, visual artists in Mexico and Mexican-American visual artists have a tradition, I discovered, of creating Loteria art. So this is Teresa Villegas. She has an amazing website. If you're curious about this, you can go on and look at it, where she does these installations where she makes dozens of these, and then she puts them all on walls together. So you can see her kind of fanciful interpretation of La Corona with the flowers. La Poetisa there's a little description of this particular poet. And La Telenovela, which was one of my favorites. So you can see that the couple are kissing and simultaneously killing each other at the same time. So what I discovered is that there's no one set of characters in Loteria. You can invent whatever characters you want. So if you're doing Loteria art, you can have, La Telenovela or La Quinceañera or whatever the word for cell phone is. I think I saw one of those at one point. Or you could do a card that represented the internet or whatever you want. So people not only create art based on the existing characters like La Corona or something like that, but they also invent their own characters, and some of them become quite political and ideological as they're making points about things. So this particular example of Loteria art is by Jose Guadalupe Posada, who apparently is a really important Latin American drawer, an artist that I'd never heard of. I'd never heard of any of this. So there's his example of the devil. And that's a very famous Loteria set. So you can see all of this online quite easily. So there's a great article about there by Island Stavens, who's a professor in Latino and Latin American culture at Amherst College, about his experience playing Loteria during his Mexican childhood. And it's in AG&I online. This is a great article about the history and the culture of Loteria. He writes that his neighbor would chant a brief riddle. For example, okay, Gina, read that for me, because I can't do it.
Where are you?
It's like, portate bien cuatito, si no te lleva el coloradito. Say it.
Portate bien cuatito, si no te lleva el coloradito.
That was actually pretty close to what I did, right?
Yeah,
So that would be an example, right? loosely translated into English as, "Behave properly, my friend, otherwise the little red one will sweep you away." So you don't actually say the name of the card, you give the little clue, right? And the first one to guess the answer would immediately shriek, "El Diablo," right? So that's part of the game, is figuring out what they're referring to, right? Or another riddle, "Para el sol y para el agua," for the sun and for the water. And the answer is el paraguas, the umbrella, right? So anyone with the correct images in their tabla would place a chip on them regardless of who answered the riddle. So you didn't have to answer the riddle to be able to count it, but it was this thing for children where you also learned the language and you learned a little bit about the culture. And you can see why people have been inspired to create ideological and political versions of loteria, because it's a way of expressing your ideas to children, right? As so many games are. Games are usually very political. There's a Star Wars version, just to give you an example of how many there are out there. So Stavens notes there was a plethora of sets designed for kids, as well as kits depicting heroes in Mexican history. I can't pronounce the Aztec names there, I'm not even gonna try. And famous themes such as Indian slavery, events like the independence movement of 1810, as well as the Battle of Puebla. So there would be loteria sets that would teach kids about Mexican history, stuff like that. Sites, the castle at Chapultepec, different things like that. Then there is an ecclesiastical loteria set with depictions of priests, biblical scenes, and the 7 deadly sins. So again, you can teach kids about religion that way. And I think the Star Wars set is really clever. I don't know how well you can see it, but they're actually using the original ones. So this is El Apache, which is, again, like an 1870s thing for the Indian, right? By a Star Wars character here. I don't know anything about Star Wars. You guys who do will think this is funnier. So this is the spider, this is the cactus. La Estrella is the star, right? So it's fancifully interpreted that way. So go on Google Images and you can find like some really creative loteria stuff. So who knew, right? That there's all this cool stuff out there. I gave a slide with some examples of La Luna from all different artists, just to see how the artists are interpreting all of these images. And I think some of these are really beautiful. So you have the very simple example of the moon, the sort of cartoon version. But then this one I think is really beautiful, right? So people have done all of this artwork, and you can, again, easily find this. And so people could decorate their home with loteria art. So it's a cultural phenomenon. Okay, so how did Juan Felipe Herrera come to write a book about loteria? As I said, he was inspired by a series of linoleum cuts by Artemio Rodriguez, who is a Mexican artist. So this artist had done these linoleum cuts, and you see 6 examples here. And they actually asked Juan Felipe Herrera to write poems in response to them. So that's where I'm judging the people who put together the selected poems, because it never said any of that, and it didn't have any of the images, and so how would you know what on earth he was talking about? Because he's specifically describing the image that Artemio Rodriguez had created. So if he's gonna do La Rosa, he's gonna write about that particular one. For the moment, so you can see the book. This is actually the book, Loteria Cards and Fortune Poems from 1999. And it's published by the famed City Lights bookstore, which is a really big deal in my field. Famous bookstore in San Francisco, founded by the beatnik poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti, right? So they put out this book, and I have it here if you want to look at it. So it has the woodcut, and then it has the poem, which in the selected poems was all this was just pulled out of there. Now, these are very political. So one of the ones that people have written about is La Migra, right? The immigration officer is chasing El Mojado, the wetback, right? And so he has this very scary migra officer, and then he has this terrified person running from the immigration, right? And some of them they're definitely adult, R-rated type images in some cases, and they're very political and very untraditional. So these are not the children's loteria simple things. This is something taken it to another level. So once I saw this and I understood the whole history of the artwork and how people make loteria art, all of a sudden I could make sense of Juan Felipe Herrera's poems. So just a little example of how you go on these journeys, right, and trying to understand something. So he has an audio CD with the new and selected poems, and he's going to give you a little brief description of how it all came about before he starts to read the poem. The poetry is actually kind of hard, so you'll see that when you see this
Then
poem.
all of a sudden, Elaine Katzenberger from City Lights in San Francisco sent me a whole stack of fantastic, incredible, neon feeling linoleum cuts that Artemio Rodriguez did. And she says, why don't you look these over and see if you want to write poetry, to them, with them, for them, shoulder to shoulder. And they were just fantastic, horrifying, deep images. I said, oh, of course, this is just lovely. And I was just so moved, and I did. So I wrote a whole book with Artemio's work called Loteria Cards. And first and last poem I'll share with you. The first one is called La Loteria. In my sleep, in this hurricane fiasco, she comes to me. She points to my obligations, this hammered and merciless lotto that powers down from the heavens. Loteria, she whispers. The triple-horned brother, the one in charge of cement, birth, and peace in the villages, he escapes. She is not an angel, or Herrera, Llorona, underground runner. Her foot on my liver, yes. Her eyes, yes. It is her eyes that I fear, the multiplying numbers of my life gone astray, falling. Levitate, she whispers. Take your cards and explode. Be the kitty poet who sniffs fortune in the fields. Be the city face that points toward the ambush without remorse or regret, with relish.
So what we would do in my class at this point, which you guys don't have to do because you're not in my class, is we would, of course, analyze the poem, because now we're back to Hispanic literature of the United States, right? So the students would have played the game, which they would enjoy, I'm sure. I tend to teach in the late afternoon, so I have to do stuff like this, because you got to get them energized somehow. We would have done the PowerPoints that you just saw, and we would discuss this poem. So then we would discuss, what does Loteria symbolize here? Why is she represented as female? What is, these references to Ya Llorona and all these kinds of things? And then what would happen is the students would get some randomly chosen Loteria cards that I would just give out to the groups, and they would have to write a poem of their own inspired by the card. So they could pick, the sun card and write a poem about the sun or whatever. And that would be one day. So what I'm giving you is one lesson, Tuesday, Thursday lesson. So lights again, sorry. So why I chose this one out of all of the lessons that I could have chosen is that it really showed me how you go on these really interesting rabbit trails when you do research into this kind of thing. And I was telling Henrietta, I think that for most of us, when we picture culturally embedded curriculum, our first go-to is to imagine that we're going to have the students read something, right? So it's like, okay, what article or book can I shove into my already probably too full class and make them read even more than they were reading already? And I know that for some of us, there's anxiety around that. If we're adding content to an existing course, I can't have them read any more than they already are. We have a textbook that costs $150. I can't have them read anything else. And I think sometimes it's the games and it's the little rituals, or you could, act out something, have them do something with food or clothing or whatever, or songs, and we're going to be doing that in our next segment later today. There's things that you can play songs, play videos, have them dance, have them do something that it doesn't have to be reading. It can be, something else. So you're not just cramming more reading into your class, which I know is a temptation for all of us. So Henrietta suggested that I tell you what all the books were for my class so that you would know how this is fitting into them, because this actually comes at the very end of my class. So I'll give you a little survey of Hispanic literature in the United States if you're curious. So we're starting out with the novel The Squatter and the Dawn by Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton, which is the name you get when you're a Mexican woman who marries a guy from Connecticut named Henry Burton, right? Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton is her name, right? She's awesome. She lived in California when California was taken over by the United States. And so all of a sudden it wasn't Mexico anymore, it was the United States. And really, really bad stuff started to happen to the Mexicans who'd been living here before, very parallel to the Native American situation, right? So The Squatter and the Dawn is about these people who live on a rancho in San Diego, and as soon as the country becomes the United States, there were promises that they would be able to keep their land, but immediately the land is opened up for public use, and homesteaders can just come and build things on their land. And this is based on her own life. They actually took all of the furniture out of her house and put it on the side of the road. And when she came back from a trip, there were other people living in her house. So really bad stuff happened in the 1880s in California, and it's an amazing novel about that. So we're going to start with this sort of historical work. Then another novel, Bless Me Ultima. Some of you are probably familiar with Rudolfo Anaya, who's from New Mexico. This is considered the first important Latin American novel of the current era. So he's kind of the grandfather of Latin American literature that we have today. Bless Me Ultima is very autobiographical, and it was the novel that kind of ushered in the current boom in Hispanic literary studies and is really wonderful. So we'll start with those, and those are 2 novels, so they'll write a paper about one or both of the novels. Then I'm doing 2 memoirs, because I'm really interested in nonfiction. So Hunger of Memory, The Education of Richard Rodriguez. Probably many of you are familiar with this very controversial book. He is opposed to bilingual education, right? So it's an assimilationist perspective, basically, but he's from Sacramento, so he's local as well. Really interesting book. And then the other memoir is Silent Dancing, A Partial Remembrance of a Puerto Rican Childhood by Judith Ortiz Kofer, who's from Puerto Rico and New Jersey. She grew up going back and forth constantly between Paterson, New Jersey, and Puerto Rico. She's awesome. I've actually met her. She's an incredible poet, and she's written this memoir. So then those are the 2 memoirs. They'll write a paper about that. Then we're going to do a young adult novel, Esperanza Rising. Hopefully you know who wrote this. Who wrote it, Carol? You're there. Pam Munoz Ryan. Who is from Bakersfield. You'll note that I'm heavily emphasizing Central Valley writers, which is how my class is quite different from other ones nationally that I looked at. Esperanza Rising is an amazing story about her grandmother's life in Arvin, California, in the camps, the labor camps in the 30s. And then you gotta have a good feminist play in every class. So we're gonna be doing Josefina Lopez's Real Women Have Curves, and I've already convinced Julia to perform this. It's not gonna be until spring of 2018, because of the literature rotation. So this class is already done, but I'm not going to teach it for 2 years. This is sort of the way things go. But she's going to perform this. It's 5 women in a sewing factory in East LA, experiencing what it's like to be a woman and struggles and stuff like that. So this is really awesome. And then we'll end with the poetry. So we'll do the Herrera book, and then because it's the end of the semester, this is the size of book that I teach. Gary Soto, who's from Fresno, of course, A Fire in My Hands, which is actually a children's poetry book. And then they're going to do a big cultural project. So they're going to be doing, throughout the semester, they can make a film, they can write a poem sequence, they can paint a painting, they can do a dance routine, they can do any kind of art work that they want to do. They can video people and interview them and make a film. They can do any kind of thing like that. And then they will be performing these at the end of the semester. So there'll be that element to it. And I'm also using 12 children's picture books and 12 films in the class. So like interspersed throughout these 8 books are the 12 picture books and the 12 films. So super fun. So I want to encourage you guys, if you haven't done your class yet, it was the most fun I've had in forever. I actually really enjoyed doing it. I learned so many new things that I never knew. And I had a reasonably okay understanding of Hispanic literature because I'm an American literature specialist. So it wasn't like I knew nothing about this, but I learned so much more. It was so exciting and fun for me, and I can't wait to teach the class. So I'm really bummed that it's going to be 2 years from now, but you know how fast it all goes. So that's my class. That's an example of my class. So the hope for the coming days is that you guys will be creating lesson plans much like the Loteria one, where you get to actually put something together and then fit it into the bigger picture of your class. So this was meant to be a little bit of inspiration.